kind of open up this process again, or where are we?
Well, I do think the president has to get involved and show some leadership here. If you think about the political dynamics, Republicans sort of disagree on the Ukraine question, but are unified in our belief that we need stronger border security measures. The Democrats disagree on the border, but are unified in their belief that Ukraine needs to get a lot more resources. I think that actually creates a real opportunity for some negotiation, but unfortunately the president has to participate in that process.
Can you kind of clarify where you are on the Ukraine Endgame? I've seen comments attributed to you suggesting you'd be okay with Ukraine giving up some percentage of its territory in a peace negotiation. Talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Well, I think if you look at how mismatched the militaries are, there's really no pathway to peace that doesn't run through some negotiation. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying it was good that Russia invaded Ukraine. I'm not saying it's good that Ukraine has to give up territory. But they have made no significant progress despite hundreds of billions of dollars of American aid. Is another $100 billion really going to accomplish anything? Or will it take Ukraine further down the pathway of becoming effectively a dependent of the United States of America? My worry here is that the country is effectively being destroyed. The average age of a service member in the Ukrainian army is now 43 years of age. They can't pay their pensioners. If this goes on another year, are we dealing with a country, or are we dealing with a rump state that depends on America indefinitely?
What message do you think that sends to, let's say, Taiwan? That if you get invaded and you can only last a year or so, if you can't win in a year, you got to give up 20% of your country.
No, look, I think, first of all, Taiwan is a much different priority for America than the Ukraine is.
Why do you think that?
Well, in part because they produce such critical economic ingredients of our own economy that if Taiwan was taken over by China, it would give the Chinese even more leverage over the United States. Whereas I think Ukraine, obviously it's an important country, it's just not nearly as important to America's core national interests as Taiwan. I think the lesson all of us should take away, the Taiwanese, the Ukrainians, but most importantly American policymakers, is we do not have the industrial base to support multiple conflicts at once. You already see evidence that we're taking shipments of weapons that were planned for Israel, diverting them to Ukraine, or planned for Ukraine and diverting them to Israel. The takeaway from this conflict is actually that America needs to build more of its own weapon systems. And while we're rebuilding that industrial base, we can't pretend we can fuel 3 conflicts at once. We just can't.
One more thing,
Sure.
Because I think it speaks to the other argument. I've seen attributed to Zelensky that he talked about the idea that if Ukraine loses this war, you'll have a migrant crisis of their own right in Europe. Is that a European problem? Did anything in that line of thinking affect your thinking on this at all? That you could have a huge displacement of people again if Ukraine fully loses this war?
Well, it's actually hard for me to imagine Ukraine losing much more people to migration. I think they've already lost close to 25% of their country. This is a country that had 40 million people, now has 28 million people. Most of those people have been refugees to western parts of Europe. I don't know how the migrant crisis could get worse than it already is. And it's not just Ukrainian migrants, but it's also the food crisis in Africa that's putting tremendous pressure on African food prices because they get so much of their wheat and grain from Ukraine. I actually think if this thing goes on much longer, you could not just have a Ukrainian migrant crisis, you could have a full continental migrant crisis, and it's one of the reasons why I'd like to bring this thing to a close.
Great. Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.